This is a post-resurrection encounter with Jesus. And Jesus is meeting his disciples. They didn't realize they were going to meet him. But he's met them. They were out on the lake. They were catching fish, supposedly, but caught nothing. And then, of course, there was this miraculous catch of fish. It was the second time. Luke chapter 5 records the first at the earlier end of Jesus' ministry. And now, as if to bracket it at the other end of his ministry, there's a second miraculous catch of fish. 153 large fish were caught, and what they discovered was that it was Jesus on the shore who was instructing them. And as they got to shore, they discovered that Jesus had already got fish of his own, and he had already lit the barbecue, and he was busy cooking the fish for them, and was having breakfast prepared. Well, they've eaten breakfast, and this is where the story now continues. So, John chapter 21, verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" And Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that that disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" Well, may the Lord bless his word to us this morning as we come to look at it. And say the second part of where we were last week. And today we come to perhaps the really difficult bit of that encounter. The first bit was strange, shall we say. Strange in the sense that here are these disciples, they've gone back out onto the lake to fish. Most of them, if not all of them, were probably fishermen by trade. What does that tell you? It tells you that probably, following Peter as they were, that they were thinking, if not had already decided, that they were going back to their fishing jobs. Having said that, I think that you could make a reasonable case to say that throughout the whole of the 3 years of ministry, that there were times that when they were in the Galilee region that they went out onto the lake to fish. But I think that looking deep into the heart as Jesus does with the piercing eyes that he has, that he saw what was really on their minds, that there was I think a bit more than even doubt. I think there was a kind of a decision that was going on in the heart of these men that they were now going back to their old way of life. But that was not an option for them. Jesus had called them 3 years earlier. And you'll recall that Jesus was walking along that same beach, maybe even exactly the same spot. And he saw them out there, mending their nets, getting ready for the next night of fishing. And Jesus says, don't bother with that. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Follow me. They left everything and followed him. That was not for a fixed period contract, as we like to have today. It was not some kind of short-term 3-year thing that says after you've done your 3 years with me, you can go back to it. That was not the deal. The deal was follow me. And indeed, for those 3 years, they had followed Jesus all over the country. And once or twice, perhaps even stepped across borders. But basically, wherever he had gone, they were there. And they had followed him all this time. And now their cages had been rattled so much in these last few weeks. There was a bit of a whirlwind of things that had happened. But you might say to yourself, as indeed I did for many years, when you come to this story, that surely they weren't really thinking of going back to fishing. Maybe, I used to think, maybe they were there one night and, Jesus hadn't promised to come and see them every single day of the week. What else were they supposed to do? They're sitting there, it's night time, they're fishermen, there's a boat and there's the lake. Wouldn't you be tempted to go back to it? Even if you were to describe it as, it's now my hobby, just go and do a little bit of fishing. But I think there was something much deeper going on here. And I think that Peter certainly had decided in his own heart that he was no longer a follower of Jesus. I think he felt that he had failed the test and that Jesus would no longer want him. And we need to go and look at some of those scriptures that will lead us to that conclusion. So if you've got a Bible open, you might want to just follow through some of these scriptures with me. They're familiar anyway, so I'm sure you'll pick it up. I'm going to stick as much as possible with John's Gospel because it's John who's testifying here. All the Gospel writers contain records of these incidents, but let's stick with John in the main. I want to go back to John chapter 13. Now in John chapter 13, the scene is the upper room. The scene is the upper room. They're having the Last Supper. And Jesus is telling these disciples all the things that are going to happen to him. And then Peter makes a very bold claim. John chapter 13, and let's read from verse 36. The disciples, they're beginning to get the hang of the fact that Jesus is about to leave them. Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered him, "Would you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. How much was Peter prepared to lay down his life for Jesus, I wonder? Let's go across to John chapter 18. It's the same night the very same night, a few hours later, Jesus has now been arrested, and Peter has already tried to show how much he was ready to defend Jesus. He'd taken out his dagger, his sword, and he managed to chop off the ear of the high priest's servant. And Jesus said, enough of that, we're not here to fight with swords. But was Peter really that bold? Was he really prepared when it came to the crunch? Jesus has been taken into the house of the high priest, into the great courtyard. And we read that a disciple that was with him, probably John, almost certainly, was allowed in. Apparently he knew the high priest. And I don't think that means a case that he was friendly with him, but they recognized him and said, yeah, you can come in. You're one of his disciples too. That was actually putting himself in danger. But they wouldn't let Peter in. Eventually, the disciple, probably John, gets Peter into the courtyard too. And John records it like this. First of all, chapter 18, verses 15 through to 18. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. And he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter was waiting outside the door. The other disciple, who was known by the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You are not one of his disciples, are you? The girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and the officials stood around a fire that they had made to keep warm. And Peter also was standing there, warming himself. The first denial. We go just a few verses later, and Jesus is now being questioned, and there's a bit of a commotion going on there. And then we come back to the Peter scenario again. Verse 25. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, are you not one of his disciples? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the cock began to crow. There's nothing like the cock crowing to jog the memory. And you can imagine that just at that time, at that very moment that the cock began to crow, that Peter would instantly think back to those hours earlier in the upper room, the very things that Jesus had been speaking about. Did I really do that? 3 times, just as Jesus said, I've now denied him. But Luke gives us another detail that John omits. But I think it's a significant detail. It's the only one of the gospel writers who includes it. Luke chapter 22, and in verse 61. Let's go back to verse 60 just to put it into context. Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Just as he was speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered. Can you imagine what that must have been like for Peter? So bold as he was. Lord, I'm ready to die with you. I'll go anywhere with you. I don't care what they do to you. I'll suffer the same things as you're suffering. And then just a few hours later, to have found yourself denying it. He didn't even realize he had done it the 3 times, just as Jesus predicted. And then lo and behold, that there in another part of the courtyard is Jesus. He's bound up, yes, But as the cock crows, so his head turns very deliberately to look straight at Peter on the other side, standing around the fire. And as their eyes must have met, what must that have done to Peter? We're told that he went outside and wept bitterly. That's what it did to him. He broke down. Something inside of Peter, I think we could almost say, died at that moment. Peter realized what a failure he had been. Now, although between that incident and the incident that we're looking at today in John 21, that Peter had indeed seen Jesus, and Jesus hadn't actually broached that subject yet, there was something in that relationship between Jesus and Peter that had broken down because of Peter's failure. And Jesus isn't going to leave that undone. I said to you last week that the Lord has the habit of doing that he doesn't leave things undone. That where there are broken relationships, he comes to repair them. And sometimes that can be really difficult. Sometimes it can be so hard for us when the Lord starts to deal with those areas of our lives where we failed him. And he starts to point them and say, now is the time. We're going to deal with that. You might have forgotten about it, but I haven't. Not yet. Not because God has got a long memory. I mean, some of us, we remember things for the wrong reasons. We have grudges. Jesus didn't bear a grudge. Far from it, Jesus loved Peter deeply. But he had to sort this out before they could move on to the next stage. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing here in John 21. I love the grace that Jesus uses. He gets Peter out of the boat. Peter dashes across the water. I say dashes across. This time he's not walking on water, but he's probably swimming now. He's to shore though. He wants to get there as quick as he possibly can. Now, the first thing that Jesus could have done with him is said, before we have breakfast, I've got a bone to pick with you. I've got something to sort out with you. But he doesn't do that. He welcomes them. Breakfast is there waiting for them. He serves it to them. And when they had finished eating, then and only then does Jesus start to tackle the main reason I believe that Jesus appeared to them on this occasion. Here it is. The first thing I notice about this encounter is the way in which Jesus addresses Peter. Some, I think, make far too much fuss about this. I will say this before we look at the actual way in which Jesus addresses. You'll remember that Jesus called Peter and said to him, you are Simon, son of John. From now on, you will be called Peter, or Cephas, meaning rock. But actually, it was interesting. I did a quick little study of the Gospels this week. And on most occasions, by far the majority, the times when Jesus speaks directly to Peter and addresses him by name, as recorded in the Gospels, he still calls him Simon. Once or twice, I found where he called him Peter, according to the Gospel writers. But the vast majority of the time, he still called him Simon. Isn't that interesting? That it was Jesus who said, from now on you're going to be called Peter, and then he goes back to calling him Simon. And yet the Gospel writers, when they refer to Peter and talk about him, 9 times out of 10, they're now calling him Peter rather than Simon. So by the time the Gospel writers are writing, which could have been 30, 40 years later, his name is well established then as Peter. Everyone knows him as Peter. He's now firmly established as that rock that Jesus envisaged. But he had a long way to go. And most of the time, Jesus was still calling him Simon. But here, he does something a little odd. Jesus doesn't do this very often. There are just a handful of occasions when Jesus calls him by his full name. Simon, son of John. I wonder if that struck something inside of Peter, whether it revived something in him, as he remembered the first time that Jesus came to him and he saw him by the shore and he called him Simon, son of John, as recorded in one of the Gospels. Simon, son of John. And you know, don't you, when somebody who is very familiar with you, a friend, a relative, or more than likely your mother, who called you by your full name, and you knew whenever they called you by your full name, there was trouble ahead. It's the only time they ever used it. You just knew it. You've all known that, haven't you? I remember a friend of mine saying to me when I was talking to her about her mother, such a sweet lady. And I knew her mother for many years, and I mean, butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. She was such a lovely, lovely lady. And her daughter, Maddie, said to me one day, she said, she was absolutely wonderful as a mother. She said, but there were just a handful of times, she said, when I can still remember her calling me Madeline. And she said, the moment she called me Madeline, she said, I knew that I was in trouble. And she said, I can honestly say, she said, it probably only happened half a dozen times, which is probably no reflection on the behaviour of the girl. I think it was more to do with the temperament of the mother. But she said there were just a few times when she got angry, and when she didn't, it was always Madeline. We've all seen that. We've all experienced it. Jesus now does it to Peter. Simon, son of John, he addresses him. But then you see, something comes out now, and forgive me if you already know this, but for the benefit of those who are less familiar, because the English doesn't do justice here to this passage at all. Because Jesus says to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Do you love me more than these? And he uses that word which has been translated here, and I think you've got to remember that Jesus probably spoke here in Aramaic, not Greek, but it's written down in the Gospels originally in Greek. Do you love me? From the word agape. So here he says to him, Simon, son of John, do you agapeo me more than these? And Peter responds to him in a strange way. Yes, Lord, you know that I like you. Isn't that odd? Jesus says to him, do you have absolute brotherly love for me? The deepest affection? And he responds back and says, you know I like you. If somebody said that to you in response, you would instantly pick up, that's not what I asked you. You would instantly pick up the reserve that was coming through from the respondent, in this case Peter. Peter was holding back. There was something that was preventing him from responding to Jesus with the words that Jesus used to him. But Jesus carries on. Feed my lambs. I don't know whether there was any time lapse in between, or whether Jesus came straight back with the question again. But certainly, he repeats again. Simon, son of John, do you truly love me deeply, wholly, intimately, like a brother? Peter responds. Notice this time he doesn't say more than these. He's now forgetting the rest of the disciples around him. He's focusing right on Peter. Just let's get to the heart of this, Peter. I asked you if you love me deeply as a brother more than the rest of these disciples, because you said that even if everybody else deserted you, I would never do so. But you couldn't even say back to me that you loved me deeply with all your heart. You came back and said you liked me? Peter, let's deal with the first part of the question, shall we? Do you love me so deeply, so intimately? Yes, Lord. You know that I like you. Take care of my sheep. The third time, he said to him, that's Jesus says to him, Simon, son of John, do you like me? That must have been cutting. Jesus doesn't even bother to ask, do you love me anymore? He says, do you like me? I'm even questioning whether you like me, Peter. I ask you, do you love me? You respond, you like me? I ask you again and give you a chance, and you respond back that you like me. But given your performance just a few weeks ago, I'm going to ask you the question, do you even like me? What kind of a friend are you, Peter? And Peter, it says, was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, not do you love me, but do you like me? See, what Peter was hurt about was not that Jesus asked him 3 times, but that on the third time he asked him, not do you love me, but do you like me? Do you even like me? That's what hurt. Peter was having issues that he was working through internally. And he was struggling with this. He knew he'd been a failure. He was racked with guilt. And yet Jesus comes back and even questions, do you even like me, Peter? It's interesting how Peter responds to this. Because Peter now turns, he knows that he's not going to win an argument. He knows that there is no point in him protesting how much he liked or even loved the Lord. Notice what he does. He now turns to the fact that Jesus knows all things, the omniscience of God. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you or like you. What he's saying is this, that Lord, you can see deep into my heart. You know what's really deep down inside of me. But you know how I'm struggling to bring that out, to express it. You know how I'm struggling to cope with my failures. How I am still grieved at what I did to you. You know how much pain I'm experiencing. You know all things, says Peter. You know what's really deep in my heart. Jesus once again says to him, "Feed my sheep." But then he goes on. He's left that part behind. Jesus is now satisfied that he has dealt with that issue that Peter was struggling with so much. He's confronted it. Indeed, the Lord does know all things. The Lord does know just how hurt Peter was at his own failure. That Peter thought that perhaps he'd been written off, that Jesus didn't want him anymore as a friend, let alone one of the apostles. And now here is Jesus dealing with him in a very powerful way, and yet at the same time in a necessary way, if he's ever going to be useful for the kingdom again. And sometimes we need to learn that we fail spectacularly sometimes. And when we do so, it is right that we have to put things in their right order. Put everything right with the Lord again, in order for him to be able to restore us and to return us back into his service again. And that's what Jesus is about to do. Because just as they were on that very beach those 3 years earlier, and Jesus had said to them, "Come and follow me. I'm going to make you fishers of men. Forget going out there on the lake. From now on, you follow me." And Jesus is about to do the same thing again. But he tells him something before he does that. Verse 18, "I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." Those were Jesus' words. And then John, writing his gospel many years later, and almost certainly after the death of Peter, adds, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Now, let's just stop there for a minute. That tells me several things. Number one is that actually those very words were an encouragement to Peter. I'm not sure Peter saw them as an encouragement at the time. They were an encouragement to Peter. Peter, tradition tells us, was crucified upside down. It said that they came to crucify him, and he said that he would not be crucified in the same manner as his Lord, and so asked to be crucified upside down. Now, whether that's true or not is irrelevant. The point is that Jesus said that when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, which was a reference to crucifixion. That you will be crucified, Peter. It tells us several things. Number one, Jesus said, when you are old. Peter was far from old at this stage. In his day, he would have probably been considered as a middle-aged man. Far from old. When you are old, Peter, that tells us that he was going to have a future with the Lord. Secondly, that he would stretch out his hands and be crucified. There was only one reason why they would stretch out the hands, why they would crucify a believer. And that is because they would not deny Jesus. Because they would not say, "I do not believe that in Jesus, or I refuse to turn away from the faith." Those were the reasons why believers were put to death in the future. Not because of denial, but because they held fast to the faith. So he can see straight away that Peter in the future will be very faithful in his service. He's going to be an old man, and he'll get to the point where he's put under the pressure and says, "I will not deny my Lord." It also tells us that he was going to be a faithful leader of the people, because Jesus was reinstating him to feed the sheep, the lambs. That Jesus was far from finished with him, that he was going to be a key person once again. You always find in the Gospels that wherever Peter is mentioned with the other apostles, he always comes first. He's always there first. He was the natural leader, and Jesus is not taking that away from him. He says, you are the one who is going to feed the sheep, feed the lambs. And so this restoration is almost nearing its completion. And as Jesus comes to the end of this breakfast meeting, he says to him, and again these words must have rung so piercingly in Peter's ears as he said it, because he says this to him, follow me. Follow me. If you're prepared, Peter, to accept those words that I've just told you, that one day you will be crucified. And notice that he speaks of it by the death by which he would glorify God. That's how we know that it was for sure that Peter was not going to recant on his faith. You will glorify God by that death. Follow me. And at that point, Jesus must have got up and started walking away. Peter is faced with a choice as Jesus begins to take those steps. He can stay there on the beach with his boat and his fishing nets and the 153 less the ones they've eaten for breakfast. Or he can begin to follow Jesus. And as Jesus walks away, and Peter begins to follow him. But as he does so, we find that there is another disciple who begins to follow too. Verse 20, Peter turned around and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. So we know they were on the move. When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? And he's asking, what about his death? Is he going to be crucified too if he follows you? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Peter, stop worrying about other people's faith, about other people's situation. Worry about yourself at this moment. Follow me. If I want something different for him, that's up to me. And I think that Peter at that point must have realized that Jesus had brought him back into the fold, so to speak. That he had brought him back into that place of being that key follower. That Jesus was not angry with him to the point that he was going to turn his back on him forever. But Jesus had indeed restored Peter. That Peter was indeed following him. It's interesting that never again do we read of Peter on the lake. Never again do we read of Peter on the lake. From that moment on, the lake is left behind. From that moment on, he's where all the action is, often in Jerusalem. And then further afield as he goes out to take the gospel, following Jesus as indeed he should. I want to finish, though, by turning to Peter's own writing, 1 Peter chapter 5. Peter, writing many years later, by this time he probably is an elderly man, and he's remained faithful right up to that point, and indeed right up to the very end. And now Peter has the opportunity of beginning to pass on, or to continue passing on to others, what he has learnt, what he knows, what has been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit, the teachings that have been formed and developed and matured in his own life. And Peter writes now to a new generation of those who will continue the church where Peter has had to leave off or is about to leave off. And he says this in chapter 5, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1. To the elders among you, I appeal as fellow elders, a witness of Christ's sufferings, and one who is also willing to share, or will share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you are willing as God wants you to be. Not greedy for money, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being an example to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Jesus told Peter to go and feed the sheep, to look after the flock. And now Peter, as an old man, looks to the new generation and he says, feed the flock, look after the sheep, be an example to them, lead them by that example, give to them the things that they need to nourish them, just as I have done. Be the good example to them, just as I have tried to be to you. You see, Peter never looked back from the moment that Jesus reinstated him and brought him on. And now, subsequent generations later, we still carry on doing the same thing. We still lead by example. And then we have to find new people to take our place and to say, come on, there's the next generation too. Feed the flock, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care. Peter is indeed a tremendous example for all of us, but especially, I think, for those that are called into pastoral ministry, to leading the flock. Because although we have many examples, of course, of good pastors throughout the years, that our first and perhaps supreme example of the human shepherd is that of Peter. I say human because Jesus, human, yes, but God too. But of the continuation of that shepherding, it's Peter that we look to. Now we have to be careful. You can take that to an extreme, as some churches do, and kind of venerate Peter to a place that they should not do so. But at the same time, we look to him and say, here is an example of someone who fell spectacularly, but was raised back up again. Someone who had his failings, and yet the Lord said, I can still use him. As long as he's willing in heart, as long as he is prepared to accept and to acknowledge his failings. And that's true of all of us, wherever we are in Christian service, that whenever we look and see our failings and are prepared to acknowledge them. Peter repented with weeping. Perhaps we need to do more of that sometimes. But the Lord says, but I still want you. I still have a place for you. I can still use you. Peter, a great example of what it is to be a servant of the Lord. Let's just bow our heads and pray.